The third frost of the season had hardened the gravel of the carriage sweep when the ledger went missing, and Eleanor Vane stood at the foot of the great staircase at Harrogate Hall, with the cold of the stone coming up through her thin slippers and the certainty in her chest that no one would believe her. Above her, on the half-landing where the tall window let in the grey November light, the master of the house stood with his back to her, listening to the man who had taken everything from him without his knowing it yet. She had warned him once in September beside the dairy, when the figures in the accounts had first refused to agree with the figures in her own quiet sums. She had warned him again in October, in the library, with her voice low and her hands folded so they would not shake. Both times he had thanked her with that grave courtesy of his and turned away, and both times the man on the landing had smiled at her over the master's shoulder, a smile that did not reach his eyes, a smile that said she was only the companion to his aunt, and her opinion weighed nothing against his word. That smile was the thing she would remember longest. Not the missing ledger, not the frost. The smile of a man who knew he was believed. If you have ever spoken a true thing twice and watched it fall on the floor between you like a dropped glass, then you already understand the particular loneliness of Eleanor Vane that morning. Stay with her a little while. What the season had decided about her was not the last word, though it would take a winter to prove it. To the household at Harrogate she was a useful nobody. That was the phrase Mrs. Tell the housekeeper used, not unkindly. When she set the breakfast trays, the useful nobody who reads to the old lady and keeps her accounts straight. Eleanor had come to the Hall 11 months before, when the position of companion to the Dowager Lady Harrogate had fallen vacant, and her own circumstances had fallen with it. Her father had been a clergyman of small means and smaller luck, a man who had taught his daughter Latin and arithmetic and the keeping of a fair set of books, and who had died owing more than the living had ever paid him. There had been an arrangement once, a young man with prospects in the law, and the arrangement had quietly dissolved the week. The debts became known the way such arrangements did. She had learned then what she was worth in the open market of the world, and the figure was not flattering. She did not expect to be chosen. She expected to be useful, and to grow old being useful, and she had made a kind of peace with it that was not peace, so much as the absence of any further hope to be disappointed. The master of Harrogate was Julian Ashworth, the Earl of Harrogate, and he had inherited the title and the encumbered estate together 2 years before from an uncle who had spent 40 years and a fortune on horses that ran slowly. The Earl was 38, tall, dark, with a jaw that held itself like carved stone and eyes the color of smoke over a winter field. He spoke seldom and never wasted a word when he did. The county had decided he was cold, and the county was not entirely wrong, but it had mistaken the cause. Eleanor, who watched him across the dinner table 3 evenings a week while the dowager talked, had come to think his coldness was less the absence of feeling than a wall built in great haste around something that had been broken and not yet mended. She did not know what it was. She only knew that he flinched very slightly whenever his late uncle's name was spoken, and that there was a door on the second floor that was always kept locked. The man on the landing was Mr. Crane. He was the steward, and he had been steward to the old Earl before him, and he had the manner of a man who had decided long ago that the family he served could not run a day of its own affairs without him, and had set out to make that decision true. He was perhaps 50, smooth and well-kept, with a soft voice and soft hands, and a habit of standing a half-step closer to people than was comfortable, as though intimacy were a thing he could simply assert. The Earl trusted him completely. That was the trouble, and Eleanor had seen the shape of it before she had any proof, the way one sees the shape of a reef under calm water, by the way the calm is just slightly wrong. The first warning had come in September. Eleanor had been keeping the dowager's private accounts, the small household sums that an old lady likes to have neat, and in the course of that small, honest work she had noticed that the price the estate was charged for its coal did not match the price the dowager's own scullery was charged for the very same coal from the very same merchant, and that the difference, multiplied across a winter and a great house, came to a sum that would have kept a family for a year. She had checked it 3 times. Then she had gone out to the dairy where the Earl was inspecting a sick cow because she had heard he was there, and she had not the courage to request a formal audience for a thing she could barely make herself believe. She had told him plainly. He had listened, the way he listened to everything, with his whole grave attention, and then he had said that Mr. Crane managed the estate's purchasing, and had done so faithfully for 30 years, and that coal prices varied, and that she was not to trouble herself with matters outside the dowager's rooms. He had said it gently. That was almost worse. Eleanor had curtsied and gone back inside. And she had heard 2 days later from a maid that Mr. Crane had remarked at supper in the steward's hall that the new companion fancied herself a woman of business and ought to mind her embroidery, a provincial bluey stocking with ideas above her station. That was the second phrase, and it traveled. It came back to her through 3 mouths before it reached her own ears, which is how such phrases always travel, gathering certainty as they go. She might have stopped there. A wiser woman, a woman with more to lose, would have stopped there. And Eleanor had been raised by a man who believed that a true account was a kind of prayer, that the books either balanced or they lied, and that a person who let a lie stand in the ledger let it stand in the soul. So in October she did the patient, unglamorous, dangerous thing. She watched. She copied figures by candlelight into a little book of her own, a thing no longer than her hand, bound in faded green that had once held her father's sermon notes, and she kept it inside her stays where no maid turning out a room would find it. She walked to the village on her half-day, the one free afternoon allowed her, 2 miles down the frost-rutted lane in her one good pair of half-boots, and she went first to the coal merchant's wife, who was glad of company and a cup of tea, and saw nothing strange in a clergyman's daughter asking in her mild companion's way what coal fetched these days and whether the great house was a good payer. The woman told her freely. The figure she named was a third below the figure entered against the estate, in the very accounts Eleanor had been forbidden to question, and Eleanor wrote it down that night by candlelight, and felt the cold settle in her stomach that was not the cold of the room. She went to the corn factor's clerk, a careful young man who measured every word, and got from him, by patience and by asking nothing he could refuse, the price the estate was billed for its winter feed. She went to the draper who supplied the household linen, and stood among his bolts of Holland and dimity, while he complained, as tradesmen will, of how the great houses bargained him down to nothing, and named the very sum he was beaten to. And it was not the sum the estate books recorded paying. She went, on a second half-day, the long way round by the south wood, and spoke to a woodman cutting kindling, who told her without being asked that a great deal of good timber had gone off that wood in the spring. Crane's order had been carted to the river, and Eleanor walked home in the early dark, and found, when she checked, that no timber sale from the south wood appeared anywhere in the estate's accounts at all, and the little green book filled, line by patient line, in her fair, clear hand, with the difference between what the estate paid and what the world charged, and what the estate sold and what it never recorded, and every line of that difference ran, by a route she could now trace as plainly as a stream runs downhill, into the private purse of Mr. Crane. When she had it whole, she went to the Earl a second time. It was evening, in the library, the one room of the hall that felt to her like a living thing rather than a monument. The fire was lit. He was at the long table with the estate maps unrolled before him, and the candlelight made the planes of his face severe. She had asked Mrs. Pell to tell him she begged a quarter hour, and he had granted it, and she stood across the table from him with her little book in her 2 hands and laid the whole of it before him, quietly, in order, the way her father had taught her to render an account. The coal, the corn, the linen, the timber sold off the south wood that had never reached the estate books at all, the sums, the route, the name. She did not raise her voice. She did not accuse. She only showed him the difference between 2 columns of figures and let the difference speak. He was silent for a long time. The fire spoke instead, settling in the grate, and a coal broke and fell with a small sound that seemed very loud. She watched his hands, which were still on the edge of the table, the long fingers spread on the dark wood, and she watched the muscle move once in his jaw, and she thought, for one trembling moment, that he believed her. He drew the little green book an inch toward himself across the table. He looked at the column of figures she had set against the column from his own accounts, and his stillness changed in a way she could not name but felt, the way one feels a change of weather before the cloud arrives. Then the library door opened without a knock, and Mr. Dow. Crane came in unsummoned with a sheaf of papers under his arm and an apology on his lips that was not an apology. Saying he had not known his lordship was engaged, and his soft eyes went to the little book between them and understood the whole of it in an instant, and the smooth voice grew gently, regretfully concerned. He was so sorry to intrude. He had hoped, he said, to spare his lordship this. The poor young woman had been making inquiries in the village these weeks past, asking the tradesmen after the estate's private affairs, and there had been talk he had done his best to suppress out of regard for the household. Talk that a companion in her uncertain position, carrying such tales about, might be hoping to make herself important in the master's eyes, or worse, to throw up a screen of accusation against another, before some small irregularity of her own, in the dowager's accounts, should come to light. He said it all slowly, with downcast eyes, with the very accent of sorrow. He had even, he confessed, with every appearance of reluctance, taken the liberty of glancing over the dowager's household book that very week in the natural course of his duties, and had found there a discrepancy of some pounds that he had not wished to mention, and prayed his lordship would allow him to look into quietly for the young woman's own sake. There was no discrepancy. Eleanor knew her own books were clean to the last farthing. Knew it the way she knew her own name, for she had been raised to keep them so. She opened her mouth to say it. And then she saw, in the slight loosening of the Earl's shoulders, in the way his attention slid from the plain book to Crane's grave, and concerned and infinitely familiar face, that the seed had already taken root in the prepared ground of 30 years. It is easier to believe the smooth thing you have trusted half your life than the plain thing a useful nobody has told you twice. The Earl closed the estate maps. He said in his level voice that gave nothing away that the matter would be looked into, and that Miss Vane should return to her duties for the present, and that there would be no more inquiries made in the village. And Crane held the door for her as she went out, standing his customary half-step too close, and murmured, low, just for her, that she should be careful that a woman alone in the world had only her good name to keep her, and that good names were such fragile things, so easily cracked, so impossible to mend. She lay awake that night and understood that she had played her whole hand and lost, and that the man who had robbed his master for 30 years now knew exactly who she was and what she knew. She understood that the careful thing, the safe thing, was to be silent now and small, to keep the dowager's books and read the dowager her novels, and let the great wrong run on into the dark where it had always run. She understood all of this. And lying there in the cold, narrow bed under the eaves, she found that she could not do it, and she did not entirely know why, except that her father's voice was in her saying the books either balance or they lie. What she did not yet know was that the Earl had not slept either. The morning the ledger went missing was the morning everything turned. Though it did not feel like turning while it happened, it felt like falling. The estate's main account book, the great ledger Crane kept in the muniment room, the one document that would either confirm Eleanor's little candlelit copies or expose them as the inventions of a meddling woman, was found to be gone from its shelf. And it was Crane who announced it, with sorrowful gravity, in the front hall where the servants could hear. And it was Crane who suggested, with every appearance of reluctance, that perhaps his lordship might wish to know who had been seen near the muniment room of late, and whose interest in the estate's books had become a matter of household talk. He had set the trap and sprung it in the same breath. The ledger would never be found, because Crane had burned it, and its absence would be hung about Eleanor's neck. She stood at the foot of the staircase and watched the Earl on the half-landing listen to the soft voice describe her guilt, and she felt the cold come up through her slippers, and she thought, "This is the end of me here. She will turn me out by nightfall. Where I will go, I do not know." But the Earl came down the stairs. He came down slowly, and he did not look at Crane, and he stopped one step above Eleanor so that for once she was not looking up at him from a distance, but nearly level with his grave smoke-colored eyes. And he said quietly so that the listening servants could not hear. 3 words that she would turn over in her mind for the rest of her life. He said, "Come with me." He took her not to the door and out of it, but along the corridor to the library, and he shut the door and he stood with his back against it for a moment, as though he were holding something out rather than holding her in. Then he crossed to the long table and unlocked the drawer beneath it, with a key he wore on his own person, and not on any ring that Crane could reach. And he took out the great estate ledger, the very book that had been announced missing not half an hour before, whole and present and his. Eleanor did not understand. He saw that she did not understand, and something in his face eased by a fraction. He had taken the ledger himself 3 nights ago, the night after she had laid her little book before him. He had taken it because he had not been able to sleep after she left, because the plain order of her account had lodged in him like a splinter, because for 2 years he had felt the estate bleeding from some wound he could not find, and had told himself it was the old Earl's debts and bad luck and the price of coal. And because a woman he had twice dismissed had stood across his table and shown him, in 2 columns of figures, the exact shape of the wound. He had taken the ledger and he had sat up with it, and with her village inquiries, which he had not in fact forbidden so much as wished he could unhear, and he had checked her figures against the book line by line through the small hours, and her figures were true. Every one. He had known by dawn that his steward of 30 years had been robbing his uncle and now him, and that the only honest accounting in the house had been kept in candlelight by his aunt's companion, whom the whole county called a provincial blue-stocking, with ideas above her station. He told her this plainly, standing at the table, not as a confession of love, for he did not yet know it was that, but as a confession of error, which in a man like him was nearly the same thing and cost him more. He said he had let her warn him twice, and had not listened, and that he was ashamed, and that he had announced nothing of what he knew because he wished to give Crane room to act, to overreach, to do the one thing that would put the matter beyond any soft explanation. And Crane had done it. Crane had announced a missing ledger that was not missing, in front of witnesses, and had named the woman he meant to ruin. A man does not invent a theft. He did not need to invent, unless he is hiding a theft of his own. "Come and sit," he said. "You are cold." And it was a command in his level voice, the way all his kindnesses came out as commands. And Eleanor sat, and only when she was sitting did she realize that her hands had been shaking, and were now, slowly, beginning to be still. The Dowager Lady Harrowgate was the next. To learn the shape of things, and she learned it in her own sitting-room with her embroidery in her lap and her sharp old eyes missing nothing. She was a woman of 70-odd years who had buried a husband and a son, and had no patience left for anything but the truth. And she had grown fond of her quiet companion in a way she would have denied under torture. When her nephew told her in his spare way what Crane had done and what Eleanor had uncovered, the old lady set down her needle very deliberately and was silent for a long moment, her sharp eyes fixed on the middle distance, and then she said only that she had always thought Crane stood too close to people, that a man who would crowd a duchess in a doorway, as though he had bought the right to her heir, would certainly rob her blind, given the keys. And why, in the name of common sense, had no one in the house troubled to listen to the girl? She had warned them, the dowager said, and a household that will not hear its one honest voice deserves the steward it keeps. It was not quite an apology to Eleanor, who sat very still in the corner, with the embroidery silks in her lap. The dowager did not deal in apologies. She had outlived the use for them, and had outlasted most of those who once owed her one. And yet she put out her dry, papery hand, and took her companion's young one and held it hard for a moment, and looked at her with something that was not far from pride, and that from her was a great deal. Now the matter had to be made true in the world, and not only in the library, and here the Earl moved with the patience Eleanor had not known to expect. He did not confront Crane. He did not turn him off in a rage which would have given the steward time and motive to destroy what evidence remained, and to spread his soft poison through the county first. Had. Instead, the Earl sent, quietly, by his own hand, and his own most trusted groom, for his solicitor in London, a Mr. Prabby, Hartwell, and for the magistrate of the district, an old friend of his late father, and he asked Eleanor to make, in her fair, clear hand, a full and ordered copy of everything she had found, with the village witnesses named, the coal merchant and the corn factor's clerk, and the draper, every one of whom had been paid less than the estate was charged, and could swear to it. And while she wrote, through 3 days he came and went from the library, and brought her tea she had not asked for, and told her more than once to eat something, to rest her eyes, to stop working, and walk in the cold garden with him, for the good of her health. It was on one of those walks, the second day, in the bare formal garden, where the box hedges were rimed white and the fountain stood silent and frozen, that something between them changed which had nothing to do with ledgers. The afternoon was still and very cold, the sky a flat, unbroken pewter, and their breath went up before them in small clouds as they walked. He had given her his arm at the terrace steps because the gravel was slick with ice, and she had taken it because to refuse would have been a remark in itself, and she had been conscious the whole length of the long walk of the warmth of his arm under the wool of his coat and the careful half-inch of air she kept between them and the way he shortened his dong stride without seeming to match her own. They had walked in silence to the end of the long walk, where an old sundial stood furred white with frost, its gnomon throwing no shadow under that shadowless sky. And they had stood looking back at the gray face of the hall with its many cold windows, and Eleanor had said, because she could not help it, and because the silence had grown too full to bear, that she was sorry to have brought such trouble into his house. And he had turned to her, and the careful distance he kept about himself was simply not there for a moment, gone like a coat set down, and he said that she had not brought the trouble. She had only seen it, and that the fault was his, for the 2 years he had spent among people who told him what was comfortable, and that he had forgotten. Until a clergyman's daughter stood across his table and would not soften it. What it was to be told a plain, true thing by a person who wanted nothing from him in return. He said her name, Eleanor, not Miss Vane, and the saying of it hung in the frozen air between them, like the breath that carried it, and she felt her heart go on, suddenly loud in her own ears, loud as a clock in an empty room, and a warmth rose in her face that had no business there in that cold, and she looked away first down at the frost on the sundial, because she did not trust her own face to keep its counsel. That was all, a name and a held look and the white garden, and then they walked back. And yet she lay awake that night for an entirely different reason than fear, and she was honest enough with herself to know the difference, and to be frightened of it in a new way. For a woman who has decided she will not be chosen, the first true evidence that she might be is its own kind of danger. She had built her peace on expecting nothing. He was, with 3 days of quiet kindness, taking that peace apart. The reckoning came at the Martinmas gathering, the great dinner the Earl gave every November for the county families, the one fixed public occasion of the Harrogate year. It was the same long dining room where, 11 months before, Eleanor had first taken her place at the foot of the table as the companion of no account, and where the county had first looked at her plain gray gown among the silks, and decided what she was. The candles were lit the length of the table. The orchestra the Earl had hired played in the gallery above. The county sat down, 30 strong, to the Earl's table, and among them, in his place of honor at the steward's customary seat near the foot, sat Mr. Brooks. Crane, smooth and confident, for the Earl had let him believe through all those careful days that the matter of the missing ledger was tending exactly as Crane wished, that the meddling companion was under a cloud and would soon be gone. There was also that night a Miss Carstairs, the daughter of a neighboring baronet, a handsome young woman in ice-blue silk, whom the county had long since appointed the natural mistress of Harrogate, and whom the dowager had been gently pressing on her nephew for a year, and who sat near the head of the table in the full confidence of a woman who has been told all her life that she is the correct choice. She had looked once at the Earl's companion in grey and dismissed her with the small economical glance such women keep for furniture. The dinner went forward. And between the second course and the third, when the talk had settled and the room was warm and bright and entirely public, the Earl rose, as a host rises to make some small remark, and the table quieted, and he did not make a small remark. He said that he owed the county an account, and that he was a man who paid his debts. He said that for 2 years he had believed the troubles of his estate to be the legacy of his late uncle, and that he had been wrong, and that he had been told the truth twice plainly by a member of his household whom he had not had the wit to believe. He said that the estate had been robbed, methodically for 30 years, by the man it had most trusted, and he named the coal and the corn and the timber off the south wood, and he set down on the white cloth, where every neighbor could see, the great estate ledger that had been declared missing, and beside it, the fair, clear copy in Eleanor's hand, with the village witnesses named. The room went very still. The orchestra, taking some signal from the gallery, had stopped between airs, and the silence was complete as the silence of deep snow. And into that silence, Mr. Crane began, in his soft, unhurried voice, to say something about a misunderstanding, about the unhappy inventions of a disappointed woman, about 30 years of faithful and unblemished service to 2 generations of the family. And the Earl let him speak. He did not interrupt. He let the whole soft poison run out into the bright candlelit room, every practiced drop of it, and the county listened, and the county, which had eyes in its head and could read 2 columns of figures laid open on a white tablecloth, began, one face at a time, slowly, to understand what it was looking at. A lady near the middle of the table put down her glass. An old squire leaned forward to see the ledger better, and did not lean back. Then the Earl spoke the only words he needed, and he spoke them looking not at Crane but at the woman in grey at the foot of his table. He said, "Miss Vane warned me twice, and she was right." 8 words. In a level voice, in the room where the county had decided she was nothing. He did not make a speech of it. He did not destroy Crane with rhetoric. He simply set the truth on the table beside the ledger, and let it be seen, and the seeing did the rest. Miss Carstairs, in her ice-blue silk, looked from the Earl to the woman at the foot of the table, and understood, with the quick, cold understanding of a person whose long campaign has ended in a single sentence, that the field was lost. The magistrate, who had been seated quietly among the guests, and whom no one had marked as anything but a neighbor, rose now and named himself, and said that he had examined the evidence and the witnesses, and that Mr. D. Crane would answer for it at the next assize, and that he would be detained that night. And Crane, the smooth confidence gone all at once from his soft face, made one motion toward the open ledger as though he might yet snatch it back, and stopped, because there was nowhere in that bright watching room for his hand to go. He had protected nothing, in the end, because he had believed for 30 years that no one in the house could read the books but him, and the one person who could had been keeping a clergyman's daughter's quiet count, by candlelight all along. They took him out. The county dinner did not collapse into scandal and noise, because the Earl did not permit it to. He sat back down. He asked the orchestra, with a small gesture, to resume. He turned to his neighbor and spoke of the frost and the prospects for the hunting and the county. Taking its cue from its host, as the county always does, folded the strange turn into the ordinary evening, and went on, and only the most watchful guest would have seen that the Earl's eyes returned again and again down the length of the candlelit table. One to the woman in grey, who sat with her hands folded and her chin level and her whole life rearranging itself silently around 8 words. Later, when the guests had gone to their carriages and the candles were burning low and the great house was settling into its night, the Earl found Eleanor in the library, where she had gone because she did not know where else in the altered world she belonged. The fire was low. She was standing at the long table with her hand resting on the closed ledger. The honest book, as though to be sure it was real. He came and stood across the table from her in the place where she had twice stood to warn him, and the positions reversed between them seemed to strike them both at once. For a moment, neither spoke. Then he said that he had wronged her twice and could not undo it, but that he meant to spend a long time trying, if she would allow it. He said that he had grown used these few days to a house with one true voice in it, and that he did not wish to go back to the comfortable silence he had mistaken for peace. He said her name again, Eleanor, and this time he came round the table, and he stopped close to her. Closer than was proper, and he did not assert the closeness the way Crane had asserted it like a thing he was owed. He offered it like a question, and waited, and Eleanor, who had decided long ago that she would not be chosen, and had built her whole quiet endurance on that decision, found the decision simply gone, dissolved like frost in sun, and she did not look away first this time. She told him the truth, because she had never learned any other way to speak to him. She said that she had warned him because she could not bear a lie left standing in the books, and that she had stayed when wisdom told her to be silent because she had come, against all her own sense, to care what became of him and his house. It was not a declaration of the ordinary kind. It was an account rendered fair and full, and it was the truest thing either of them had said. He raised his hand and let his fingers rest very lightly against the side of her face, where the firelight was. And she did not move, and the clock on the mantel went on loud in the quiet room, and neither of them needed to say the rest of it that night. Some things, once seen, do not require announcing. If Eleanor's winter has stayed with you, stay to the end of it. There is a little more, and it is the warm part, and she has earned it. They were married in the spring, quietly, in the small gray church on the estate, with the dowager in the front pew dabbing fiercely at eyes she would have denied, were wet, and Mrs. Hell and the household ranged behind, and the magistrate, now plainly a friend, standing as a witness. Miss Carstairs had married a viscount in February and was said to be very satisfied with the arrangement, and the county, which had so confidently appointed her the mistress of Harrowgate, transferred its confidence to the new countess without the smallest sense of contradiction, the way counties do. Crane had been convicted at the assize. The witnesses Eleanor had found standing plain and unshakable in the box, and was gone where soft voices and soft hands count for nothing. The south wood was being replanted. The estate's books kept now openly by the countess herself, with a clerk she had trained, balanced for the first time in 40 years, but that is the public account, and the public account was never the one that mattered most to her. On an evening early the following winter, a year almost to the day from the morning the ledger went missing, Eleanor sat in the library at the long table with the great honest ledger open before her, and the fire high in the grate, and the first snow of the new season falling slow and silent past the tall windows. She had been a wife for the better part of a year, and still could not quite walk into this room without remembering the cold coming up through her slippers, and the smile of a man who knew he was believed. The locked door on the second floor stood open now. Behind it had been only the portrait of the old Earl, turned to the wall in grief and shame, which Julian had at last turned back to face the room, the wound named once between them, and not spoken of again. He had given her, that autumn, a small thing she kept on the library table, her father's worn old account book, the one he had taught her from, which Julian had quietly purchased back from the man who had bought up the clergyman's effects against the debts, and had bound afresh in plain dark leather, and had set into her hands without a word. It sat now beside the great estate ledger, the small, fair book, and the large one, the father's count in the houses, and she rested her hand on the two of them together as the snow came down. The door opened. Julian came in from the cold with the snow still on the shoulders of his coat. And he did not say anything, because he had never wasted a word in his life. And he came and stood behind her chair and looked down at the two books under her hand, and after a moment he set his own hand over hers. The fire settled in the grate. The snow went on falling past the window onto the dark garden where the winter before he had first said her name in the frozen air. She had warned him twice and he had not listened, and then he had listened, and the listening had remade them both, and the books on the table at last told nothing but the truth. Thank you for staying until the end of Eleanor's winter. If some quiet, warned, and unheeded voice in your own life ever proved true in the end, I hope it was witnessed as hers was, by someone whose witnessing remade the world.